Hello, welcome to week 3 for the third and final video of the third week of the SUNY History of Jazz Special Topics, Humanities 610, History of Jazz. We are once again drawing from John Swed's Jazz 101, A Complete Guide to Learning and Loving Jazz. We're going to discuss Beiderbecke in this video. This is the third, again, of 3 videos in week 3. First video discussed Louis Armstrong. Second one, Sidney Bechet. Now we'll talk a bit about Beiderbecke. Okay, so I'm going to quote a bit from Swed. We'll discuss it in the context of what we are listening to on the YouTube playlist for the week. Basically, Beiderbecke in the context of Frankie Trombauer and his orchestra. I'll get there in a sec. So, why are we talking about Beiderbecke? Just to have another foil for Armstrong, not only, but again to re-emphasize that Armstrong is, even as I got done celebrating his singular contributions, it is important to make sure that we see a complete, if not complete, at least a more realistic picture of how jazz developed as a soloist art away from collective improvising to soloist plus accompanist kind of hierarchy. It's a central important change from early jazz to swing era and bebop, from the teens, 20s to the 30s, 40s, and beyond. Okay, so Swed writes, Beiderbecke was the natural foil to Louis Armstrong. What he brought to the music was something quite different from Armstrong. Bix's horn was the softer, rounder-toned cornet. Cornet is, a cousin of the trumpet, quite similar, saying softer and rounder tone. It's true, not quite as declarative. Armstrong played the cornet very early in his career and switched to the trumpet, the perfect foil for his exuberance, if you will. You can be exuberant on a cornet, but the implication is that the cornet suited Beiderbecke's stylistic approach in a way that Armstrong's trumpet suited him better than a cornet. Okay, a bit facile, but fair enough. The fact is, either would do what they did on either instrument in their sleep, right? Or not, if not in their sleep, despite whatever they're holding. But anyway, Bix's horn was the softer, rounded tone cornet, and he played with a distinctive sound. Here's what matters: the fabled bullet hitting a chime timbre. Timbre is the color of sound, the quality of a sound or of a tone when it's sounded, and a smaller, sometimes completely absent vibrato. Instead of that Bechet huge, intense vibrato, or Armstrong's often intense vibrato, it's kind of the opposite. His range was limited. Again, the opposite. Armstrong's range was unlimited. His playing not virtuosic, the opposite of Bechet and Armstrong again, right? Those guys could do anything and did in every solo, it seemed, right? Leaping and, skyscrapers, right? Beiderbecke's approach was quite different. Rather structured and formal. Interesting, here we're getting a kind of connotation for structured and formal that we're not, when Swed writes about the power of Armstrong's or Bechet's improvisations, he's saying, well, they were structured and formal, yet also wildly improvisatory and in the moment. It's not that Beiderbecke wasn't improvising. He was, but there's a way that structure can feel structured, and there's a way that structure can feel unstructured, perhaps. Right? This is kind of the distinction he's pointing out. With a smaller amount of notes used. Literally, again, the range, not only the range from high to low is smaller, but the choice of notes, right? There are 12 in the tempered scale. There are 12 notes in the chromatic scale, right? All the white and black keys on a piano from from C to C or from F sharp to F sharp, however we want to cite it. Within those 12 notes, in any scale, chromatic scale, moving up or down the piano, Swed is saying that Beiderbecke somehow chose less of them at any given time. I think what he's saying in general is that Beiderbecke's playing was more measured in almost every ways, in every way than, say, Armstrong's or Bechet's. Less exuberant, basically. Though he played the blues, and again, the blues is many things. It's a form, it's a sentiment, it's essentially a sensibility of flattening, of bending pitch, and of giving a sort of microtonal treatment to a pitch, of sliding into it, of sliding out of it, of falling away from it, of bending, of reprioritizing instrumental tone production or vocal tone production, same thing, of reprioritizing tone production to not focus on a kind of European-centric, is this hitting the middle of what in tune means. Are you playing a note perfectly in tune, and are you valuing that as the ultimate in your aesthetic approach, or are you bending pitch? Are you employing a blues sensibility? And Beiderbecke was. And so he's saying, though he played the blues, he often stressed the bent quality of the note, leaving it hanging in the air, underlying it as if to call attention to it as an artifact. His melodies do not astonish, but they reassure. His notes cascading in an easy, relaxed manner. There were moments of genuine excitement in Beiderbecke's playing, short flurries of notes played loudly, yet they sometimes seemed forced, as if he were obligated to show he at least knew how that kind of jazz was played. So we're getting into this kind of dialectic, if you will, of cool versus hot, of black versus white, hot jazz, black jazz, cool jazz, white jazz. These are critical tropes of the early 20th century that we need to interrogate. It's not that there aren't black players who played in an understated, quiet manner, nor does it mean that there aren't white players who played fierce and exuberant. Of course there were, and therefore it is facile and dangerous to just associate ethnicity with stylistic approach or with aesthetic value, and yet we can't not identify that those were conversations that were being had, or those were tropes that were being established through critical and scholarly discourse and through other musicians' stylistic interpretations of these kinds of innovations. Swed writes, it's an oversimplification of the blurred lines between race, commerce, and art in the jazz of the 1920s. An oversimplification, right? But it is nonetheless true that Beiderbecke became interested in large orchestras and late 19th century classical music from Europe and the United States. Again, Armstrong also did. Hawkins did. Bechet did. Miles Davis did. Jazz music, and a host of others did. Jazz musicians were fascinated. Charlie Parker did. It's like, don't make me get started with a list, right, of jazz musicians influenced by classical forms or European forms. Of course they were. And yet this oversimplification has existed in critical discourse for a long time. We have the hot approach of Armstrong and his acolytes. We have the cool, measured response of the Midwestern white Beiderbecke and his cool jazz, kind of proto-cool jazz that beget West Coast jazz, etc., etc. Let's be careful of those oversimplifications at the same time that we are acknowledging that there are a range of interpretations, again, as jazz is moving along, barreling along in the early 20th century into towards World War II. This is sort of, Beiderbecke's era, Armstrong's era, these primary eras of between the wars, the jazz age, right, getting into the swing era in the 30s. Swed writes, it was Beiderbecke the stylist who heightened interest in this cooler form of jazz, which offered an alternative to the hot jazz of the 20s. He demonstrated that this music could be played lyrically, almost gently, with a softer, sweeter sound, while still paying allegiance to the black rhythms and vocal inflections that were driving jazz. Okay, so Swed is not saying black Armstrong, white Beiderbecke, hot, cool. He's not, he's also pointing to these oversimplifications, but at the same time, it is not untrue to point out that Beiderbecke the stylist was somehow the face of, or one of the faces of, these were racially charged times in the 1920s, of course. America's always wrought, right? Overwrought, in fact. And there was a kind of, as Chet Baker would be later with Jerry Mulligan and other figures, and Dave Brubeck and other white jazz musicians, there was a sort of a different way that Beiderbecke was palatable or understandable to, Louis Armstrong, King of the Zulus, and these other kind of stylized, essentially racist ways that he was perceived and presented and complicit in. This is important to note too, right? These kind of racial stereotypes that we now look on and cringe, right? We do. Were understood as de rigueur for the time, and so these kind of, as much as these are oversimplifications, they are simplifying complex things that were in fact happening at the time. And so I bring up this last quote from Swed also to point out this idea of a stylist, right? You'll hear me talk about this all semester. It's not that there's maybe polarities, right? Innovation and stylism. On one hand, you have someone who's innovating, pushing forms into new directions through the strength of their musical personality and achievements and all the above. On the other hand, through the strength of musical personality and achievements, you have someone who is taking pre-existing materials and perfecting them and representing them and embodying them and codifying them and all the above, and yet not really changing them in any meaningful way or exploding the form and forcing something new on everybody what they hadn't heard before. No, a great stylist is not necessarily is often not an innovator. Is usually not, almost by definition, is not someone who is blowing up what happened before to make a new path. It's someone who is like riding a great stylist is the ultimate expression of, in some ways, things that already existed. They're putting sentences together in different ways, perhaps, but those sentences are still the sentences that we know already. Beiderbecke, again, it's a bit oversimplifying to say someone was only a stylist or only an innovator. They're sort of both in a way. Again, Beiderbecke sort of innovated this, or was amongst the innovators of this kind of cooler approach, of this more measured approach of not wild abandon all the time. But in fact, if we listen to the evidence, the recorded evidence is the evidence that we have, just like a science experiment. In music, where's the evidence? Well, it's on the recordings, right? If we listen to Beiderbecke, there are hot moments. It's just that, that's what it says. It's almost like he wasn't convinced himself in those hot moments. Like, I'm doing this to show you I can, but here's my real personality. A little more reflective, a little more spare, less vibrato, less exuberance, all those things, right? So, in the example we're going to listen to, Frankie Trumbauer and his orchestra crying all day. Beiderbecke is sort of one of the signature members of that orchestra. In fact, perhaps the signature member. Sued writes, and this is from our YouTube playlist, right? In a blatant attempt to recreate the success Frankie Trumbauer had with his recording of Singin' the Blues in 1927, this song we're hearing now, Crying All Day, from later that year. So remember, this is the same era as Armstrong's West End Blues, 1925 through 27, right? Attempted to build this performance on the opening of Trumbauer's solo on the earlier record. This is relaxed, cool music that contrasts to the wired, nervous quality of much of 1920s music over a loping bass saxophone part played by Adrian Rollini. A saxophone section led by Trumbauer sets up a sweet little melody against which Bix Beiderbecke and the tart-toned clarinetist Pee Wee Russell, again an important soloist of the day, take solos. It's over quickly, but a mood has been established that's not easily forgotten, right? So what is that mood is the point, right? Against this backdrop of an orchestra in the 20s pointing the way forward to swing orchestras of the 30s, you get this soloist statement from Pee Wee Russell on clarinet, tart-toned, but also from Beiderbecke. That's what we're really listening to here. How is he approaching the soloist role in almost every way differently than Armstrong and Becke, right? That's what I want us to think about for this week, essentially. Here's our rise of the soloists. Here's three important, solo flag bearers, right? Louis Armstrong, Sidney Bechet, and now Bix Beiderbecke. How is Beiderbecke's approach quite different than what we heard in the other examples? Okay. In the YouTube playlist, also, I should say there's another example of Armstrong's genius, along with the great pianist Earl Hines, which you'll take a listen to, and also there is, I can remind myself, there is also, an example of sort of a post-Beiderbecke approach as well in Red Nichols. Okay, so that's week 3, a little bit about Bix Beiderbecke.